So let me introduce our illustrious panelists here. All the way to my right is David Gill, who's a partner with EY. It's now EY, not Ernst & Young, so everybody EY. David is here joining us today to offer some expertise on the accounting and tax issues for UK-based companies heading into China and vice versa. And next we have Tim Watkins, who's the VP Western Europe for Huawei. How many people here know Huawei? Okay, well this is an astute audience then, that's great. Of course, the China tech titan, and Tim has been leading their efforts here in Europe and really doing a lot of investing and R&D work with our universities here in the UK. And then next we have David Mott, who's a managing partner from Oxford Capital. And finally, we have Mike Powell, who's a partner and managing director at Woodside Capital Partners. So maybe I'll sit down and join you there. And we'll have a little bit of time for audience Q&A afterwards, so you can warm up your questions meanwhile. So I'm interested in what you think are some of the best tech sectors that UK-based entrepreneurs and emerging company executives should go after. What are the real hot areas? Is it still e-commerce, social media? We heard a little bit about semiconductors. Semiconductors seem to be an area that was fading, but now it's coming back really strong. So what are the areas now? LED, solar? What do you think?
We're all looking at you, David. Well, I'll give a kick off. I think one of the really interesting areas that Huawei is getting involved in, given everything that we've heard about the march of Weibo and the huge volume of subscribers, is the question of mobile payments across social networking. I think this is going to be a huge advance, and it'll go very, very rapidly. A lot of countries, a lot of regulatory issues, but when we've seen what Tencent have done with Weibo, it's just astounding. And I think that's one area to really watch.
Okay, so Woodside Capital focuses on some fairly narrow verticals where M&A and strategic fundraisers. We concentrate on semiconductors, photonics, material processing, energy systems. So, you know, clearly those are the areas I know about, but what I can tell you is that all four of those areas are very good areas to be active in. And they've really been driven by two mega forces. The first one is this huge transference of data over the internet, and then the other one is just this desire to do more with less energy, and that's the other big driver behind processing energy.
Just to add another one to the mix, I would add education. So education technologies is massive. Everyone in China is spending as much money as they possibly can on the education of their children. At Oxford Capital, we backed a company called Gazoob. We've licensed from Oxford University Press their #1 children's asset, which is a series of children's character books with the characters Biff, Chip and Kipper. Anyone know Biff, Chip and Kipper? I think 95% of UK children learn to read with these books between the age of 5 and 7. It's one of the biggest exports for Oxford University Press, huge in Korea and other places, and you can now download it onto your iPad and Android and so on. And so we think that's going to be a really big thing in Asia.
So there's quite a wide array of areas that entrepreneurs and emerging company execs can get into then. Do you still think it's a pretty wide open playing field for anyone who's entering now? Or do you think that a lot of the good positions, top positions, have already been taken?
I mean, I think it's a really general point. The world is accelerating at an extraordinary pace with innovation and ideas and knowledge sharing, and it's becoming smaller and smaller. And I think it's only going to get more exciting.
Okay.
I mean, from Huawei point of view, I mean, Huawei probably not the best example in chips, because Huawei are building its own chipsets, of course, now, and really helping to drive down the cost of devices, you know, end user devices like handsets. But I've got to agree with the e-education. world. Huawei are building relationships with a lot of schools and universities in being able to deploy their unified communications, video conferencing, e-education platforms that will enable highly skilled educators, teachers, lecturers to disseminate their skills and knowledge to not just hundreds but thousands or tens of thousands of individuals simultaneously. So I think that there's a big march in e-education, and that's at the end of the day going to go hand in hand with the mobile payments capabilities as well, because people will be wanting to be able to pay for courses in e-education online instantly and then may sign up for more or whatever.
I'm always the guy that turns around and says, look, nothing really ever changes. And I'm just kind of thinking back to 25 years ago. I came out of the entrepreneurship side of things when I started my first business. And that was the same question back then, is aren't all the top positions being taken? And it seems to me that since then there's been 25 years of phenomenal innovation, and I don't see any end to it.
I was going to pick up on something that was said earlier about the entry into China. There's no doubt about it. Jeff Immelt of GE says, don't ever think it's easy in China. It ain't, it's hard. But while we've done a lot of work with governments, particularly UKTI, and in the past, UKTI has been somewhat ridiculed, I think, by being a bit sort of slow and not really ahead of the game. But one of the things Huawei are doing is to, obviously, to endear ourselves to the UK government ever more. We're providing a platform in Shenzhen for UK businesses to go holding hands with UKTI and get introduced to not only Huawei as one of the world's largest telecommunications player now, but also our subcontractors and suppliers. And several businesses just recently have had real success. In fact, I think one of them was mentioned earlier, Pico Chip, I think, were part of one of these programs. So that's something I would advise. Get really inside UKTI now, get onto their coattails, because they're doing a lot of good work and Huawei are supporting them.
Okay, that's good to hear. What do you think are some of the barriers to success for companies entering China today? Is it legal issues? Is it accounting issues? Is it IP protection? Is it dealing with the hyper competition there? What do you think? What would be some of the biggest barriers to success?
All of the above, I'd say.
Well, let's name one. What would be the first and foremost then?
Well, for those companies that have had a little bit of the experience and they're focused a bit more broadly on success in the broader financial, starting to make money and those sorts of things, we do find companies very concerned about the level of certainty that they can get, either with the accounting treatment, especially in this type of an industry, where how do you characterize certain streams of payments that tax authorities or accounting bodies are really not that familiar with. Right. And in a place like China, we worry quite a bit about how you deal with those uncertainties, especially as you're trying to report out to or get prepared for a public offering or something else.
What are some of the issues that trip up young Chinese companies that are headed toward an IPO? What are some of the accounting issues that they deal with?
Well, in terms of preparing for an IPO, it really is about companies crawling all over your financials and really making sure that both from the accounting and the tax, you have quote unquote cleaned up the balance sheets. Everything is in accordance with what the global investors are going to expect. In terms of the methodologies used and making sure you have that right story for all those aspects.
Do you think that we've worked through most of the issues with the Chinese companies and the accounting issues?
Well, again, I think it's an area where it's not just about the well-trodden paths and what are the revenue recognition and those types of issues. It's if we're talking about technology, in some areas there really is not that much certainty, and so you do have just the practical as well as the issues of how of a particular country and the way that they have accounted for things in the past come to light.
Okay, I was thinking about all the reverse merger problems with the publicly listed companies, and just wondering if we've gone through that cycle now. We've seen the worst of it.
I certainly think it's much more visible now, and people are a bit more on the buyer beware type of approach. but you know, these are ones that also come in circles. Are we through the WorldCom? Are we through the other things that we've had elsewhere in the world? You know, there will be other versions.
Okay.
I mean, I think that's one very important. But actually, EY do a lot of very good work with Huawei to help Huawei with its accounting practices coming the other way, coming outside of China into the rest of the world. I mean, obviously, I'm more experienced with taking Chinese products into Europe and the rest of the world, but I do see a bit of evidence. I think one question you raised, I think I would give an answer, is I've seen some of the businesses we've introduced to some of our subcontractors make presentations, and they haven't really thought through the value proposition that they're wanting to impart into the Chinese market. They've got a value prop for the domestic market from which they come, but they don't have a very deep understanding of what value they're going to bring to the Chinese and how it can be customized or changed or properly integrated to the local market.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I mean, for European companies going to China, I think there are two aspects to it. One, if you're looking to get some manufacturing done over there, that's a pretty well-trodden path these days. It's not that difficult to find a good partner who can go out and make stuff for you. And you know, there are lots of people who've done it. So on the flip side, if you're looking to build a business in China, that's where there are probably more issues that will come about. And there, I think you've got to find ways of working with a local partner, and finding that local partner is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. But if you get it right, it can be fantastic.
Okay.
Well, and I think finding a local partner in the particular area of technology that may be evolving, right? It's trying to match up what your goals are with what their expertise is.
Yeah. Well, what do you advise? What is a good way to have an entry strategy? You're sitting here in the UK and London. You're thinking about, well, maybe I really should expand my business outside of the local market for growth and scale and all that. I mean, what's a good entry point? Where do you get started?
Well, I would pick up the phone and call Greg and Alex, who are sitting out in the audience there from Intralinks. They're a pretty good starting point for UK businesses.
Should you just go there and dive in?
Well, they have people on the ground who will help you navigate the ground on the first day.
Yeah, but you should dive in too, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I would say absolutely not. Don't just go dive in. I mean, I think if ever there's a case of actually paying for some really good advice, it's do so before you get in there. Not only traditional sort of VC advice and backing properly thought through business plans, but do your sort of your homework on the various agencies that exist out there. Really get some very strong advice.
It's certainly the case in the tech sectors that I'm involved. I think it's been mentioned already earlier today, is that there's been sort of like a flux of Chinese nationals out into Europe and America and then back into China. So, a lot of us have got networks that we can leverage to help us get back into China and set a footprint down. So use that.
What are some of the biggest issues that your portfolio companies have faced in expanding in China? I mean, are there specific instances that you could talk about without naming names?
Well, I can think of there's a couple of examples. One of them is a biofuels business that we've been building. It's an international business. They've got operations in Brazil, the US, and China. The Chinese operation was extraordinarily difficult to get going. We were working with a distressed asset over there, and then there were all sorts of problems with the owner and complications with the Communist Party, and we basically lost a year. And I think these are probably, I won't go into much more detail, but I'm sure there are people here who've faced similar issues, and there are plenty of war stories. One of the ways we've addressed this going forward is we try and always work with strategic investors as much as possible. I think you mentioned bringing strategic investors into Exmos, and I think that's the right way to go in that part of the world. So in Green Biologics, we recently raised a $25 million round, and we brought $5 million of that came from the Swire Pacific group. They own Cathay Pacific and one of the big conglomerates. And they really know how to do business over there. They understand international business, and they're deeply motivated to help this technology move forwards.
Okay. Mike?
Well, I'll turn the question around the other way, because we don't actually have any businesses in China. We actually stand the other way around, which is sell European and American businesses into China. So I think a lot of people are surprised by this, that China for me is now, the question is it developing? It's not, it's developed already. I mean, there are many places you go, it just looks like any other country in the world, and there are companies like Huawei who've got the ability to project themselves internationally and acquire assets internationally. And that's kind of really where Woodside works, is to help help those companies find assets in Europe and America. So my kind of message on this is that in many ways China's maybe not that exceptional. Okay, it's an enormous economy, but it kind of looks like other cross-border countries and transactions. So,
and we're seeing that pace increasing. I mean, if you look at the companies that are coming out and exploring in Europe, whether it be in Germany, Dusseldorf, or here in the UK and London, I think we're starting to see much more, and that will continue to accelerate.
Yeah, exactly. So people are talking a lot about the economic slowdown in China. It's now, 7% growth rather than the double-digit growth we were all getting used to. I mean, is that impacting the tech economy?
Well, as far as Huawei is concerned, it obviously there is an effect, but I got to say that I sense that China as a market is very difficult, very slow to get into, and then all of a sudden it will accelerate at an incredible rate. The take-up and the access. I mean, the China population has been liberated by technology. Weibo, Twitter type services have just completely changed the way the Chinese operate. So the speed at which consumers can gobble up new value propositions is frightening. And that makes it doubly difficult, I think, for new startups going in, because it can take, there's a lot of political and regulatory barriers to jump over, and then all of a sudden it's off. So that's tough.
Yeah.
I think I would add that I lived in Asia for 20 years in Hong Kong and Japan, and my observation is that the growth will always be there, but it will be bumpy along the way, and there will be some fantastic, catastrophic highs and lows, but in the end, the growth will be there. The Chinese are, as we can see today, but they're unbelievably entrepreneurial, always have been, and where there's money to be made, they will go at it. But bubbles will inflate faster than they will in Europe, and they will burst very suddenly as well. And I think you just need to know these things as you go along.
Well, I think there, from what I've seen, there's also a much more long-term and investor focus from Chinese companies' perspective. If this one doesn't work, there's another one, or the larger companies that are coming out and they're willing to invest for the long term, whereas Wall Street or some of the other exchanges are, what did you do for me last week? And that to me is an unfortunate Western perspective, whereas the Chinese companies are taking a much longer view.
Well, yeah, and of course Huawei is an interesting example because it's a private company. The shares are owned by the employees, a bit like the John Lewis type model. And as Lord Wei, I think, was saying at the beginning, share ownership is this is a model that actually has got Chinese quite excited. So it drives a very different kind of behavior as well when you get the commitment of every single Chinese employee has a stake in the business. It's quite different. From a VC point of view and an investment point of view, it's not so exciting, but of course it's something to be very aware of, because Huawei is really probably the first Chinese company to truly globalize. It's a $40 billion business now, and operating in pretty much every country around the world. And there'll be a few others to follow.
Okay. So I'm curious about, as a journalist, I covered venture capital internationally for many years, and I've seen the peaks and the valleys, and certainly I've seen it in Silicon Valley and in China and India and other markets, as well as somewhat of the UK. It seemed that a lot of money really dried up from the VC side for European startups. So I'm just wondering, where do European startups get financing from today? Are there angels out there? Are there crowdfunding? Can they even approach a Chinese venture capital firm? What do you think?
That's right in my domain. So I used to do this as an entrepreneur, and now I help entrepreneurs do it. And the answer is, you go everywhere. You go where there's capital, and capital goes.
So
through.
it could be from China then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
There are some Chinese companies that would like to get involved in very early stage startups, and take the model of doing corporate investment in startups. There's certainly wealthy Chinese individuals that are looking to offshore their money. So yeah, everywhere. The usual list of all of the above.
So if you had to rank them?
Oh, and that's harder.
Serial entrepreneurs?
I think
who
it really
became angel investors?
Yeah, I think it depends what you want to do. I think there is an issue still in London of sensible venture capital funding. There are VCs out there that are starting to invest again, but you see some private equity companies starting to get involved at sort of much earlier stage than you would normally expect, which is kind of filling that gap. Certainly the angel funds have really made a big difference filling that gap, and you also see corporates come back to Huawei. There are American corporates with their off-balance sheet investing and directly from the balance sheet that also fill that gap as well. So I think it's always the same. For a good idea that's well presented, it's always possible to get it funded.
Well, and technology to technology, you mentioned whether it be American multinationals or European multinationals, where there is technology companies and you are a larger tech company, there is sometimes that more willingness to invest in that 10% or 5% stake in an up and coming.
I would point entrepreneurs to some of the private capital in Asia, and there are a lot of the wealth is characterized by some of the major entrepreneurial business families, first, second, or even third generation money, and they have a great risk appetite for investing and backing companies. I think Li Ka-shing, for example, has been backing a number of companies in Silicon Valley and here as well. Some fantastic successes, and having him on board is as good as having any other global investor on board if you can bag him. The question is, how do you get close to these people? At the end of the day, it's all about relationships, and that's how most business is done in Asia. And you need to know the right people who can introduce you. So one of the ways we handle that is we have a colleague based in Hong Kong, a guy called Alex. I've known him since he was 3 years old. He was my little brother's best friend, and I absolutely trust him. He's really plugged in. He's sort of American, Mexican, lived all his life in Asia, educated here, but really fantastic guy, speaks Mandarin, knows how to take companies into Asia. So he's been very helpful with our portfolio companies, either introducing them to Huawei or other potential partners, or finding the right strategic investors on board.
So what percentage of your portfolio, how many of them are actually doing business in Asia or China? All of them, or?
So our focus is to back. We have two investment strategies. It's an infrastructure strategy focused on European renewable energy. It's a very dull, boring, steady strategy, but it's fantastic in many ways. Then there's the growth capital, which is the sex, drugs, and rock and roll of the business. And here we're backing mainly technology companies, which are now at a growth stage where they're looking to scale up or roll out internationally. So all of the companies are expanding internationally one way or another. They don't all necessarily go to America or to China. I think there's lots of other places that are interesting, other parts of Asia or Latin America. Generally, it's away from Europe, actually. But so another example is a business called Oxitec. It's not really a digital business, but they're in the business of breeding sterile male mosquitoes. And these mosquitoes, when they're released into the wild, mate with female mosquitoes. The eggs never hatch, and you get a population crash. And you can reduce the population of mosquitoes in an urban area by 97% in about 3 months. And you can remove dengue fever. Now, dengue fever is pretty prevalent in many parts of Asia, also in Brazil and other parts of the world. And so this is a very exciting company which has got enormous potential
Wow.
in some of these very densely populated areas
Sure.
or tourist areas. And if you you can go on holiday or go on a business trip and not have to fill yourself with malaria pills or other things, that's going to be a benefit.
Sounds great. So we've talked a lot about China. Are there any contenders, rivals to China that should capture entrepreneurs' attention, startup executives' attention?
The really hot country right now is Myanmar.
Oh, really?
I mean, Myanmar, Vietnam has been a pretty hot
Yeah.
place to do stuff in for the last 10 years now. I don't think it's really quite made it, but there's a lot of talk about Myanmar.
Have you been there? Are you exploring there?
We have been, and with a partner we made a small angel investment in the company over there, and we've been looking
Really?
at whether or not to do something a bit bigger.
Okay.
Certainly,
No announcement.
the growth of mobile in Myanmar has been phenomenal. Huawei have built most of the networks there. They're the fastest growing networks since the market's sort of liberalised there. That's for sure. I think Indonesia is another interesting country. Age profiles of some of these mint countries really represent big opportunities, counterbalanced by the negatives, which are probably the corruption issues and well, let's say that in case of Mexico, the sheer danger of operating there. But some of these mint countries are quite exciting because again they have the capacity to accelerate. I think I think the average age in Mexico is now 29 or something, so it's quite interesting.
Is everyone familiar with the mints? The latest from BRICS: Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey. So an odd mix, but right?
Yeah. So in terms of world markets to go for, so I mean, China's obviously been talking about it, but don't forget Europe's a big market, and we're kind of here. We are part of Europe, and yeah.
So would it be better for an entrepreneur or a tech executive focus on Europe first, and then think about expanding
I would
elsewhere?
say for a tech executive, it's to break up the world in regions like that's the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is figure out what problem you're going to solve, what value you are, and then figure out where the hell in the world people are that, respect that value. And yeah, they could be anywhere. And I wouldn't necessarily break it up but I think that's particularly true in tech. But then, if you go back and turn around and say sort of like the numbers game, where are the pools of money that you can get to? You've got Europe. Don't bet against America. That would be a daft thing to do. And Brazil is a very rapidly growing economy with a lot of money sloshing around it.
But it is interesting. I mean, the point was made earlier that many people now are looking at China and saying, well, it is developed. I mean, there's still more to do,
Yeah.
but it is much more of a developed country in many ways, especially technology.
I think one of the areas that China doesn't have good capabilities is in design. And that's one thing we're seeing is that as the disposable income of the average Chinese goes up, they're becoming a little more discerning about what they buy. And the trend we're finding, in fact, Huawei are setting up a London design centre for devices and handsets. And I think this is an area that could actually be quite rich because generally China, whilst they're brilliant in all the things that we know about, global design aesthetics is probably not their forte.
Does this have something to do with the education system that we talked about earlier?
Could be body shape issues, I think as we were talking about earlier.
Okay. So are there any questions from the audience? Okay, Arnold?
Sorry, I've got a loud voice anyway, I don't need it.
No, you do, because we're videotaping it.
Thanks for the chat, guys. Really interesting. So one of the best advice I got when I first started, when it was literally just a bedroom and a dream, was that tell everyone about what you're doing because you never know who might be able to help you. So I know there's a lot of startups in the room. So what's the best advice you can give to people looking to raise initial seed funding and then maybe even Series A after that?
You're the guys.
Yeah. Guess me. I think you've already said it. It's just go kiss a lot of frogs. Yeah.
Come on, you could be more specific than that.
No, I'm a true believer at this, when you're right at the early innovation stage, it's just covering all of the bases. You can get investment from surprising areas. I mean, you've got to be somewhat sensible about it, and you can go to the guys that, have got a history and track record of investing in your particular area, but, go everywhere, no stone unturned. And certainly in the companies I've started, I pulled in sort of standard VC, but always alongside that standard VC, I had private wealth individuals investing that just came out of bumping into people and networking around. It's very important.
Sort of like the Steve Jobs effect, the way that he raised money originally for Apple, right? He just was determined, calling and calling and cold calling again until he finally got through.
Yeah.
It's like, who is this person bugging me?
Yeah, that's when you start a business at that stage, there's nothing more important in your life.
Right.
That's it.
Right. So David, from your viewpoint, I wanted to also ask you about the deal-making opportunities in China today. I mean, I've seen a lot of consolidation, a lot of the big companies buying up smaller companies, and even Youku and Tudor merging, for instance. Are you continuing to see consolidation happening there? And is that an opportunity, or is for a young company getting started to maybe be consolidated in, or is a better pathway to go public, to try to go the public route, as we were talking about with Exmos? What do you see on the deal making front?
Oh, sorry.
I think you see both, and I think the challenges are, as someone said before, they had started two companies that were eventually sold. The question is, start another one, and am I going to take that all the way through? Partly, it's the mentality of the individual who's got the startup. So I think that both paths are equally viable. I think we are still seeing and will continue to see consolidation. I think in the tech industry, it's always one where you've got a couple people with a bright idea and an infrastructure, and there are people that are out there trolling to see if that fits in their corporate structure. That will always be, I think, a very significant part of startup. I think it is, to me, a slightly harder path, honestly, to take it all the way through to IPO, partly because you have to deal with all these, the accounting and the regulatory and making sure that everything is clean as you go forward. I've been involved with some tech companies who do due diligence on some of these startups, and at some point they just say, how bad can it be? We've got the technology, we're not going to worry about whether it's exactly 100% crystal clear, although you can be burned even with the large multinationals that are now complaining about certain companies and their financial statements.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're going to see a huge amount of consolidation. Generally, for people building tech companies in this country, if they're going to go down an M&A route, the chances are they'll be acquired by an American business. It's a much higher probability than being acquired by an Asian business. However, I think there is a very strong place and reason to have Asian investors in your business to help you build that business so it is more attractive to selling to a US acquirer down the road. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it. There is a tremendous thirst for technology, for intellectual property coming from Asia. There's a huge amount of demand pull. And in Singapore, you've got people like Temasek who are investing in funds, in VC funds. They're investing in companies directly. They're setting up biotech centers to attract Asian headquarters of European businesses to be based over there. But ultimately, a lot of the acquisitions will be either European or US.
Well, and I think that's a great point. If you can show that you are moderately and or even wildly successful in that market that everybody acknowledges is a challenge, I think there's tremendous value just in that to your company.
Of course, what I should have said is once you've gone past the startup, angel round, A round, B round, the real answer is come and see me at Woodside to figure out what you do next.
Do you see Silicon Valley venture investors here knocking on doors in the UK European market now? Because I think there was some pullback, but are they here again?
Very interesting question. So there are two funds that have just been started up in San Francisco that I'm aware of, specifically for doing investment into England and Europe to try and sort of fill that gap that exists in VC.
And their names?
I'm afraid I can't tell you those.
Well, I know Excel is here.
I'll give just a different comment on that. I don't think, I don't expect a huge amount of transatlantic investment, and there'll always be a little bit at the margin. But London is a fantastic place to be building a technology business right now, and there are plenty of people looking to invest in them right now. Good businesses always get funded, and I think that's a really important point. I don't think there are clusters in Europe right now in Helsinki and London and Berlin that rival the best stuff coming out of Silicon Valley.
What do you think gives London the edge?
It's actually not even London, is it? It's Shoreditch, a little just east of Oxford Circus, and there's a couple of tiny little centres, but it's where there's just a mass of talent and ideas and incubators and activity.
It's the
angel
cluster.
investors. So it's all coming together beautifully.
Well, and
Very exciting.
And coming from outside, you actually can feel that building. I was on the train from Paris, sat down to somebody who looked about 3 years older than my daughter, and he was talking to everybody. So he just started in and told me what he was doing and the business that he was in and what he was starting. There is a passion and there's an energy that is certainly accelerating.
Do you think it could compete with Silicon Valley? Have some of the success that Silicon Valley has had?
Well, the comment I would make is that my sense is that the Americans are really disadvantaging themselves to some extent from Asian acquisitions. And Huawei itself, has been sort of rebuffed by the Americans several times over. The only significant acquisition Huawei's made has been in the UK. And I suspect, although Huawei's not a big acquisitor, it's a bit of a make inside. I suspect, Europe and particularly UK will do very well out of the Asian companies over the Americans.
Okay. Yes, there's a question here. The fellow in the red. Yes,
just
right here.
a comment too.
Could you please identify yourself?
My name is Gino Yu. I'm here from Hong Kong.
Okay.
I'm a professor at a university. We run a kind of a master's in multimedia and entertainment technology program, kind of like a Y Combinator in a university for doing startups. Then I also work with a colleague of mine who runs the largest accelerator in Hong Kong as well too. And he's got a network of angel. We do TEDx, we do the startup weekends, bar camp, and all these other things. And one of the reasons why we were here is I've been touring Europe with all of these exciting areas. I was at H Farm in Italy, and in Stockholm. There's a lot of stuff going on in Berlin as well too. And there are huge opportunities, just in terms of seeing this event, there are huge opportunities for bridging between Asian companies coming to Europe and Europe companies going to Asia. But it seemed like when the question was brought up, your options are kind of either a consultant or these networks that you have, the personal relationships you had in the longer term. I'm just wondering now, especially Frank Meehan, who was also just here too, and they raised about a $30 million fund to help startups go global. For us, what we've been trying to do is help companies soft land into Asia using a university with students and this kind of thing to explore. And then we can actually raise local money as well too to help companies soft land and then exit through shareholding, the parent shareholding structure. But I'm just curious, how do you see greater bridges other than events like this and kind of social networking? Are there any institutional models that you can see where to help facilitate this process, especially in markets in Asia where, especially in the area of mobile and entertainment, it's a lot bigger and the opportunities are there. And the creative, although having said that, a lot of the creative and a lot of the technology talent is still here.
It's a great point. How do you institutionalize those networks, those connections, and help companies? I think the good news is that for a lot of digital media startups, internet startups, they don't require a huge amount of money to be actually quite successful. And there's this whole raft of very capital efficient businesses out there which might only ever raise less than $10 million in their entire life before they become profitable, and sometimes they'll raise a lot more to really scale up. But unlike the semiconductor model, which is very capital intensive, and that will remain so. But so in that, if we just look at that example, I think there is scope for working with partners and similar incubators, and a lot of incubators that have links, I think, with each other. It's great that you're here in Europe. Fantastic. Thank you for coming over. And hopefully those connections will be reciprocated, and you'll have a few more business cards and share newsletters, and I think hopefully people will through their networks will pick up the phone or take a phone call from people. I think that's how it starts.
But do you see like universities who are moving in this direction anyways?
Well, I can talk about Oxford University. So the technology transfer arm there is called ISIS Innovation, and they've set up a thing called ISIS Enterprise, and they're helping create technology transfer institutions in other parts of the world, and they're doing a lot in Asia, in China especially. So that's an example of an institutionalized one. It's a bit more formal. But I think I'm a bigger believer in the informal links.
Well, I think universities play an informal link as well. I mean, you've got students that come from Asia into a lot of the London universities or universities elsewhere, and they're meeting and they're connecting and they're going to school with these people. I mean, that really is where startups, in many cases, are engineered anyway. So these are the informal ones where people get together, they have their networks, they have their passion for various technologies through that type of a platform.
Yeah, I gave a lecture yesterday at Royal Holloway, London University, and the 85% of their business is Asian, for sure. So there is a huge opportunity there, actually, to provide some kind of network and also retain the talent here in Britain as well, rather than let it all go back to wherever they came from. And that was one of the topics of discussion we had, is how do we do that? So that's and I don't think that's an untypical, from a business faculty point of view, that's probably a similar profile, I think, for across most business universities.
Okay, and in the back?
Thanks. I'm Heikki Haldre, founder of Fits.me, another virtual fitting room in the room. I just went to China and got a offer from the Chinese fund that on top of the 12 million we've raised so far, they would kick in another few million. My European investors, however, were really, really cautious about having the Chinese coming in. Do you see this as a repeat pattern, kind of how the European investors look at the Chinese funds?
Have your investors been to China?
One of my investors actually is very positive. The other one has, the one who has been to China is quite positive. The others haven't been and are not positive.
I think it shows there's a lot of preconceptions and pretty ingrained attitudes about what it means to do business in China. And I remember as a kid watching the adverts for Hennessy cognac in Hong Kong, and you'd have a Chinese guy and an American sitting opposite each other toasting a deal, and the American thought he just got a great deal by selling some crappy piece of real estate, and then it turns out it's one of the most valuable pieces in the world. So the American guy was always the joke, and the Chinese was always the winner. And and history shows that the Chinese in the end win. And but I think in reality there is a transfer of knowledge. There is the number of young Chinese people being educated here in the States and then going back is stronger. So English is now much stronger. They've got experience of working internationally. Theft, intellectual property is being respected a little bit more. It's great to hear you're registering patents in China. I think that's a really interesting development, because 10 years ago people weren't talking about that at all. It wasn't worth doing before. Having said that, I think we'll still have plenty more scandals and plenty more issues. I was just talking to a colleague of mine who used to work at ING, and he remembers someone in the bank having lent $100 million, and or actually it was much more. I think it was about 500 million as part of a big syndicate of banks lending to build a new factory, and it turned out the factory never existed, and the money somehow disappeared. You've got to do your due diligence. So who is this Chinese partner, and what are their connections, and what are they going to do to add value, and what are the controls you're giving away, and I think that, you just need to ask some of these basic questions. Does that make sense?
Okay. Any other question? One last time for one. Yes, Nigel?
So the Chinese growth has been... So China's growth has been driven by an export-driven economy, and particularly in the technology space. And Jim O'Neill, who came up with BRICS and mints, was postulating recently that the whole currency advantage that China's been able to engineer over the last few years, that is going to go away over the next few years, and that we're going to see a massive change in the way that China operates. It's going to be much more internally focused. I'm wondering what people think and the impact that might have in terms of investment and acquisitions, and thinking about expanding internationally with more international operations.
Well, I think if you look at the BRICS as an example, actually really only China really delivered on the vision that he was expounding. I mean, certainly Brazil has been up and down, up as much as 9% and then way down again 3 times over. Russia has been, a pretty poor example to some large extent. So these visions are interesting, but I don't think there's any one obvious winner because of the massive, certainly as far as the mints are concerned, the political instability in country, the corruption issues, the sheer danger of some of these countries are overriders of areas. Now, what's very interesting, the Chinese, particularly Huawei, are very willing to enter into those high-risk countries. Huawei have been doing huge business in Nigeria, where most international operators would fear to tread. In fact, most of the competitors to Huawei would never dream of going into Nigeria or a lot of African countries that Huawei's thriving in. So you've really got to be very clear about the risks for sure, and also the likelihood that some of these countries just won't deliver, just like many of the BRICS didn't. However, there's a wave. When a wave is coming, I think you've got to learn to ride that wave and then pull back when necessary. And that's certainly the Huawei lesson, is that it's done that exceptionally well. And when poor times prevail, they're able to pull back. Certainly not pull out completely, but rein in the investment.
Okay, great. I think in the interest of time, and also in the interest of allowing some personalized networking, I think a lot of this deal making happens face-to-face, face-to-face connections. I think we'll wrap it up here, but I would like to thank our expert panelists. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience for your attention, and I'd like to thank our sponsors, EY, Invest Hong Kong, Huawei, and of course Level 39. Thank you so much for being here. If you like what you saw tonight, please join us in one of our other markets, San Francisco, New York, Silicon Valley, Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Sydney, and so on. So thank you again. And also, in terms of clubs and networking and associations, we do have our Silicon Dragon Club, so you could check that out too.